It all came to a head last week with the eruption of what has been dubbed the Windrush scandal, sparking a raging national debate over immigration and the status of those who arrived from the Caribbean before 1973. I'm pleased to be joined in the studio today by a child of the so-called Windrush emigres. Lee Jasper, born November 1958, is a British activist who served as senior policy advisor to the equalities to the former Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, until he resigned on the 4th of March 2008. He was a Respect Party candidate back in the day in November 2012, although he's now a fully paid-up member of the Labour Party. And as a race and human rights activist, he has sat on many different committees and groups, such as the Inner London Education Authority, the Metropolitan Police, the Royal Commonwealth Society. Jasper was a witness at the Stephen Lawrence inquiry in his capacity as a representative for the 1990 Trust. He was also a campaign group member of the Lawrence campaign and claimed credit for the intervention of Nelson Mandela in the support of the Lawrence group at that time. In 2010, he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the NUS Black Student Campaign in recognition of his contribution towards challenging racism in higher education. Assalamu alaikum, Jasper. Lee Jasper, sorry, and welcome to In Focus.
Yeah, alaikum salam.
Now, you have explained in a blog how your parents arrived in Britain back in 1955 as part of the Windrush, persuaded, like many thousands of others, by the British government, the mother country, I think as it was known, to come here and to help rebuild this country after the war.
Yeah.
You pointed out that your father worked hard and had paid his taxes and insurance stamps for over 60 years. Mm-hmm. Do you think he would agree with you and the others, that the others and himself who came with him are being treated like, to quote you, third-class citizens living in a so-called first-class democracy?
I think we hear a lot, don't we, about the British commitment to the rule of fair play, justice, and equality. And certainly around the world, Britain projects itself as a progressive nation where the colour of one's skin matters not one jot in relation to your rights as an individual, as a citizen. And what we've seen over this period, and why I think the Windrush generation would agree with me on that statement, is that the court of British justice seems permanently closed to the British black community. That whether it's deaths in custody, whether it's black exclusions from school, whether it's stop and search, whether it's deportation in immigration detention in immigration detention centres, what we see is a disproportionate focus on black British people to their detriment. And so I think they would agree with me that we are third-class citizens in a first-class democracy.
And now in that blog, which you're going to see I'm going to refer a few times to today, you apologised in advance for the harshness of your language. I think you were on a roll at the time, and saying that, and I quote, "The issue was of such national importance, such profundity, that no other approach, no simplistic soundbite summary could convey the sheer anger and volatility of black British communities right now." You went on to say that the gut-wrenching, ugly face of institutional racism in British immigration policy and the brutal treatment of our Windrush generation is laid bare. Can you explain why you regard this issue of such national importance?
I don't think there can be any issue that is more important than the universal rule of law and its application to all citizens, regardless of their religious or ethnic descent. That cuts to the very heart of the notion of Britain as a meritocracy. And what we have now been revealed is that these Windrush deportees have suffered the most ignoble, horrendous, violent invasion of their privacy. Some of them have been bound and gagged on those planes. Some of them have been dragged from their homes to be put on planes, to be sent back to countries to which they have no obvious connection. And as such, I can think of no other policy, save that of a overtly racist Third Reich policy, maybe by Hitler, or indeed the Boer apartheid nation of President Botha in the 80s, that so blatantly targets people of a different hue, a different colour skin, for injustice and arbitrary detention. This is state-sanctioned racism at the highest level.
Now, in that quote, blog, I think you stated that, and I'm going to quote you, this fundamental right to unqualified British citizenship is cemented in the blood price we pay to secure our freedoms. And we walk this earth today as freeborn, sentient human beings as a result. A people who should enjoy the inalienable rights comparable to every British citizen, regardless of ethnicity or faith. British black people, regardless of their circumstances, we have seen the universal social contract between the British state and the black British citizens are not worth the value on toilet paper. I think was the phrase you used. It's not written on all. Paid for by the very taxes we pay. Sorry for messing up your quote.
That's all.
We're paying for our own deportation, you said. We're paying them to harass the SHIT out of our community. We're paying for them to deport our parents. Theresa May once argued as Home Secretary that citizenship is a privilege, not a right. Did she have a point?
She doesn't have a point, in my view. I think that the role of the British Empire during the 19th and 20th century means that the forced contributions of labour and land and resources taken from those nations mean there is an implicit social contract between Britain, the mother country, and its subjects. My father was born British. Why should he have to apply in 1973 and pay an additional money to assume his birthright? These are fundamental questions of rights and citizenship, and they illustrate here in the United Kingdom the profound extent to which black people face routine discrimination in criminal justice, in policing, and through immigration services. Can you believe that up until 2016, the government was still using our tax money to pay the former slave owners of plantations who were compensated at the abolition of slavery in 1833 and who've been receiving annual payments ever since? Those payments to those descendants of those slave owners only finished in 2016. And so this idea about hypothecated taxes, the black tax, paying for our own oppression, I think is a very powerful one.
Shocking, yeah. Now, you wrote, and again, I'm going to quote you, "We know we can go any time. However long we've lived here, whatever our circumstances, we can be snatched off the streets, bundled into the van, dragged, kicking and screaming onto a chartered plane on some God-forsaken runway in the dead of night." The Home Secretary and the Prime Minister herself have now both apologised for the Windrush fiasco. Without question, they acknowledged that a big part of the problem was how the Home Office had applied that policy that had been set in train by ministers, and they have accepted that it was more than just about a series of coincidences, a combination, they suggested, of a growing climate of fear of increasing immigrant numbers, and the fact that many of those who arrived here from in the Caribbean between the 1940s and 70s had never obtained formal documentation. In a speech at the Commonwealth in London this week, she said, I quote, "I gave an absolute commitment to the United Kingdom government, would do anything, whatever it takes, including where appropriate, payment of compensation, to resolve the anxiety and the problems which some of the Windrush generations have suffered." Do you believe that the government's response is adequate?
I'm still ringing in my ears are the promises for justice for the Grenfell fire residents. Ringing in my ears is the promises given to those deeply tragic and unfortunate group of victims who were subject to child sex abuse whilst in care or at the hands of politicians, and the inquiry that subsequently followed. I remember ringing in my ears the promises of this government made to those two very important constituencies, and of which have been shown to be both vacuous and left unfulfilled. Have I got any confidence in a Prime Minister who, under extreme political pressure, feels the need to apologise in an unqualified way? No, I haven't. Because it was this Prime Minister that, not through a happenstance set of circumstances, not some unintended byproduct of a policy, but drove through a very specific demand that we need to deport more black people out of this country. That was the informal policy, whatever the formal policy stated. And it could be demonstrated by the legions of Caribbeans, West Indians, Africans, who have been subject to arbitrary deportation and injustice by this government.
Well, this week, The Guardian published details of a letter from the Home Office Minister dated, I think, in May 2016, which shows that the government has known for years about the impact of this hostile environment, as it's been called, policy on the Windrush generation. Does that suggest to you that perhaps the targeting of black Caribbeans was deliberate?
It does suggest to me that the targeting of our communities was deliberate, very specific. You'll notice, and many of us will have noticed, that there is no white Australians, New Zealanders, or any other white Commonwealth citizens, not even white South Africans, have been caught up in this scandal. All of those who appeared now as victims are black people of Caribbean descent. Now, that doesn't happen by happenstance. You cannot randomly enforce a policy and then just by chance all of its victims are black. She's being insincere. They're being dishonest. They knew about the policy. In fact, I would say it was an implicit objective of the British Prime Minister to deport as many black people at whatever cost. And if you think about it, responding in the way that the Prime Minister was to the threat of Nigel Farage and the rise of UKIP in 2010, we have literally been thrown underneath the bus with tragic loss of life, with whole families being ripped asunder in order to feed the insatiable appetite for the Tory party for institutionalised racism and electoral success that they see as a great byproduct of their campaigning strategy. This is a deliberate policy. This is owned by the Prime Minister. This is institutionalised racism at the very highest level.
Now, you talk about institutionalised racism. The conclusion of the Macpherson inquiry into the killing of Stephen Lawrence was seen as a pivotal moment in race relations in this country when he very boldly declared that institutional racism was prevalent within the police. Do you believe that this institutional racism, now 19 years on from that inquiry, is still in existence? And do you... that perhaps there should be an announcement of a new 20-year review into whether the policies and implications established at that inquiry have been implemented?
Well, let me be absolutely clear. 1999 and the publication of that Macpherson report was a watershed moment. But by 2003, David Blunkett was already saying, as Labour Home Secretary, that institutionalised racism was an unhelpful term. Charles Clarke then followed him, and by 2007, every policy arena that was designed to hold accountable police and criminal justice service and schools in relation to the implementation of the report was abolished. Since that time, we've seen a retrenchment of institutionalised racism, a rise in racial inequality in criminal justice and policing, and I think David Lammy's recent report illustrates and highlights that black citizens and white citizens, even where they have no criminal record, are treated differently when they come into contact with the criminal justice system. The black person is sent for trial and the white citizen is given a caution. So even at the most basic level, the reality of institutionalised racism makes itself felt and impinges upon the quality of the life, hope and aspirations of a Windrush generation.
Now, you suggested that in your blog again that the British, and I quote you, the British political classes and media debates on immigration have always provided a convenient smokescreen, allowing politicians to use the issue of immigration to promote racism without reverting to overt racist language. To what degree are our senior politicians, including Home Secretaries, former and current prime ministers, responsible for promoting the climate of racism, either by their actions or by their lack of actions?
I think the ever draconian approach by successive British governments over the post-war period on the issue of immigration have led not only to this particular issue, but the whole febrile atmosphere associated with Brexit more generally, more broadly. And so it's absolutely correct, I think, that all of us bear some culpable responsibility, the media in particular. But the media has known about these stories for the last 4 or 5 years and simply refused to cover them. We launched a massive campaign, movement against xenophobia. You may remember the bright yellow leaflets with "I am an immigrant" on them, in order to counter what we were saying as the pervasive narrative of the right-wing media that consistently demonise migrants and people of colour. So it's no accident that we end up where we do today. It's a consequence of the irresponsible talk of leading politicians, the lack of ethics within a media that is largely white, largely male, and largely ignorant about the realities of racism facing us today.
I suppose that's what you were getting at when you, what I think is cynically referred to as supposed and mythical multicultural progressive nationalism. Is that what you were?
Absolutely. I mean, we're always, we're all British together, let's stand together and that everybody is equal in the eyes of the law, and that, once an African breathes the freeborn air of England, he becomes free, a free man and a freeborn man. These are the stories and the mythologies built around Britain. But in reality, what do we see today? We see a government who is engaged in the extraordinary rendition of black people from the United Kingdom who are British citizens for no other reason than the colour of their skin. And that fundamental denial of justice, I think, cuts to the real heart of this debate.
You're calling for the Labour Party, of which you are a member, to make a commitment to repeal what you have described as the dreadful Tory Immigration Act of 2014. Lock, stock and barrel, you said. You've said that, and I quote, "Whilst on paper the policy looks fine and has no obvious racist connotations in implementation, the power has become an oppressive tool of police oppression." You went as far as to describe the situation as state-sponsored racism, terrifyingly codified into law. Do you think, in hindsight, that was an accurate, perhaps maybe too brash description, or do you think that it is justified?
Well, I think the Immigration Acts of the United Kingdom are exempt from the European Convention of Human Rights and the 1976 Race Relations Act for a very specific reason. And they're exempt because there are times when public policy wants to target a specific group, be that Eastern Europeans, be that Roma, be that black people, or be that Muslims. This is the characteristic behaviour of British governments since the post-war period. So I think you can say racism is codified into law because the exemption of immigration services and the power given to immigration officers, which far exceeds anything that a police officer has, without any of the formal accountability of police officers to make complaints and to challenge poor practice, means that they've got a complete green light, freedom from the act and individual power to immigration officers whose power is virtually unprecedented and untrammeled in securing these deportations.
But you, in your own words, were that on paper it looked fine, that it was the implementation. So
all
when you call for it to be lock, stock and barrel...
All British policy looks fine until it's implemented. Let's be fair. There isn't a British policy you can name that is overtly racist in its articulation. So all of them are fine, mental health, education and so on. At the point of the implementation, and this is an important point about the power and the culture of racism, it is so powerful as a culture, it is capable of overwhelming legislation, overwhelming policy, undermining it and operating in completely contradiction to the statement of the policy, because the power, the cultural power of racism is so pervasive. If I can put it in a soundbite for you, and I know you like my soundbites, right? Culture eats policy and law for breakfast every morning.
Gentlemen and ladies, it was said here on this channel. Now, I know that knife crime has been an issue that's dominated our headlines in the last while. You've suggested that you've been publicly misunderstood in terms of your position on stop and search in response to the knife crime. The practice which saw the disproportionate targeting of blacks and ethnic minorities who, according to statistics, were 8 to 10 times more likely to be stopped than their white counterparts, and were subject to, and the whole thing was a subject to a wide-ranging criticism by community groups, political figures alike, leading to the whole thing being overhauled in 2010, with a direction that any future stop and search should be intelligence-led. Now, a study by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission found at that time that the use of police powers in this respect was potentially unlawful, disproportionate, discriminatory and damaging. Are you calling, and all have they misunderstood you, for a return to discriminatory stop and search?
No, I think that was my worry, that I saw ex-police officers saying, well, Lee Jasper has commented on the violent nature of the black community, and I have. I'm very motivated about challenging those people of violence within our own community who commit so much pain and tragedy, inflict so much pain and tragedy on our community. I will always stand up to the men of violence, but that's not a green light for racist, policist intervention by ramping up stop and search, which is further alienates our communities. You know, in New York, they tried a remarkable experiment. They banned stop and frisk, the equivalent of our stop and search. And in the 12 or so months that they banned it, they've seen murders go down with no stop and search. So this idea that stop and search is somehow a fundamental tool, plank, of policing operational response to crime is nonsense. It's held as a sort of a we own the streets fundamental red line in the mind of metropolitan police officers. They see it as being a line that cannot be crossed because it so perfectly maintains the culture of police racism that allows them to indiscriminately target black communities. They're always telling us that it's intelligence-led, and they're always arresting the wrong people.
So what do you make of the Mayor of London's announcement that there's going to be a significant increase in targeted stop and search by police?
I think the Mayor of London's committing a huge mistake. And for somebody who practiced in the legal profession as a barrister defending black and ethnic minority communities, one really has to wonder which planet Sadiq Khan is living on. There is no sense in which that you can increase disproportionality in stop and search on young people and cut anything other than public trust and confidence in the police. That's what it will achieve, and it will be a very sad outcome.
Now, we're coming to the end, sadly, of our exchange. Where to now? You've expressed very articulately the anger that's been felt out there in the black community and across all communities about what's going on here in the government. What action do you think needs to be taken?
I think that certainly there needs to be a moratorium on all deportations. One can't imagine police officers and immigration now coming into areas of big black communities and forcibly removing people without a huge backlash from the local community. I think that certainly we need to set out a legal aid strategy that gives individual rights like the Windrush the ability to access money immediately, to be able to employ professional loss adjusters whose job it is to calculate very precisely the extent of financial loss for individuals so that they can get the compensation that they've been offered. And furthermore, I'm calling a meeting of black lawyers, which takes place next Wednesday, where we're going to look at what the legal strategy is in relation to Windrush and to what extent we can hold the government to account for the promises it's made for full and unqualified compensation for these Windrush victims. But ultimately, in order to change what I see as a massive growth in racial inequality and a drain on social mobility in black communities over the last 25 years, we need a general election and we need to elect a prime minister like Jeremy Corbyn.
That's a very big ask. But in terms of public demonstrations of angst over what's happened, are there any planned?
I'm not aware of any, and my demonstrating days are long behind me as I now reach 60. So I offer advice from a strategic perspective and one with great experience. But I would have thought that the potential is for the largest black and ethnic minority demonstration against racism seen in recent times lies tantalisingly close to whomsoever would pick up that mantle.
Lee Jasper, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on Islam Channel.
Thank you.